Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways we can work together to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today we have with us Reverend Rickie Holstein. He's the promotional director for the state of West Virginia Free Will Baptist. He's written this book called A DNA Timeline of West Virginia Free Will Baptist History. And so we've got him on the podcast today to talk about this book, but I want to encourage all of our listeners to get a copy of this. Whether you're from West Virginia or not, you will find a lot of interesting history about Free Will Baptist in this particular book. So, Brother Rickie, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Good to be with you.
Now, this is quite a work. I do not think that you sat down one afternoon and put all this together.
Okay.
I would suspect there's probably even a couple of years of work in here, my friend.
More than that. More than that.
And just so our readers know, there are all kinds of statistics and facts and wonderful pictures, in the book. So I'm going to just start out, Brother Rickie, and some of us really like pictures. Let's just say that too. Why did you write this book that took all this time? What was it that got you on this road?
About 19 years ago, they started a historical committee in West Virginia. 3 men were appointed. I was one of those. And that started the journey. And I've always liked history. And we tried to get the information and kept trying and trying. Very slowly at first, we got some information. Finally, we kept persisting, sending out letters, making phone calls to the clerks time after time after time. We finally got actually in the book, there's actually 100 church histories recorded there, plus about 35 other churches that I do not have histories, but we have pictures of. So about 135 of our churches represented in the book, but it was a labor of love, but we've enjoyed every step of it.
It's
learned a lot along the way.
Yeah, so we need to say also, West Virginia has quite a history, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And
very different history.
A very different history. So our listeners may say, oh, I don't really believe that. Share with them some of the unique history of West Virginia and West Virginia Free Will Baptist.
Well, the most unique part about it is the way it started. Our state was birthed out of the Civil War, and so was the Free Will Baptist movement in West Virginia. In the late part of the Civil War, about halfway through it, there was a great cry for help for slaves and freed slaves in the Harpers Ferry area, the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. They were gathering there. There was an arsenal there. The Union had an arsenal there, so the slaves came there for refuge. But we had people from Maine come down. A lot of the ones that first come was a 21-year-old by the name of Nathan Brackett, came from Maine, a missionary. There was a bunch of women missionaries that came, and they came to that area, began to work with the black folks there, the slaves and the freedmen, and they began to develop Free Will Baptist. And that's one of the probably most fascinating things I discovered in this history. Our first churches, our first people were slaves, black slaves. And from thus, that began the work, and then we can talk more later about how it grew from there, but that's one of the most interesting parts of this. And some of the people that were unlikely people that were involved in helping get that together. And we can talk about that when you want.
So a lot of our listeners may not be aware that Free Will Baptist played a major role in abolition.
Yes.
Actually really pushed President Lincoln in that direction early on. And so during the Civil War, and we've got all these individuals who've been freed or already had been freed or were fleeing slavery, wow, this was an opportunity for these Baptists to put some action to what they had been preaching for all these years. So walk us through how that went along.
Okay. In the book, if you get the book and read it, you'll find that there was a Shenandoah mission was set up in that area. And they were a benevolent group that worked to help these people. That work was turned over to Free Will Baptist, and thus began that movement. One thing in particular, and we can go back uh, to probably the mid 1830s is when first interest. Let me just share one thing real quickly, if I can.
Mm-hmm.
A very prominent man in Free Baptist history by the name of David Marks placed
Yeah.
an article in the Morning Star, which was an early publication for Free Baptist, on July the 9th, 1834. And listen to what he says in his statement. He says, in the annual report to the General Conference, North America is an inviting field for the gospel labor. I almost wish I could be divided into 10,000 pieces, and every piece should go and preach the gospel. I would send one to Indiana, one to Virginia among the poor slaves, and others further west among the heathen. Now, when he talked about the poor slaves in Virginia, that's West Virginia today. That's where he's talking about. And he even had that desire to go even back then. And from that desire, he put out the publication. People began to get interested, as we said, and then over time, they came there in that area, the Shenandoah Mission, that was turned over to Free Baptist. Free Baptists began to work in the Harpers Ferry area with those slaves and freed slaves, and began to develop those churches. But they're very interesting, and I've got it detailed in the book pretty well.
You do, you really do. And so a lot of people have probably heard of Harper's Ferry and know a bit about the history of that. But really, that work that they began there, it sure did grow into something else, didn't it?
Yes, it did. It started out with a few churches, but over a period of time, they developed a lot. And our history developed in three different stages in West Virginia. The first was up in the Eastern Panhandle, and that was in the late 1860s when all the churches began to come. The people came before that, but the actual churches began about that time. And then in the central part of the state, there was another movement about the same time, and it was centered around what was called West Virginia College, not West Virginia University, but West Virginia College, which there is very little information. I did find some about that. And then the third movement started about 10 years later in the Kanawha Valley down the area where I live. But the thing to remember, and it's in the book, but all of those in the northern, up in the Eastern Panhandle, and all those in the central part of the state, back in 1910, 1911, when Free Baptist decided to merge with the Northern Baptist, we lost vast majority of all of those churches and all those works. The only work that survived was down in the Kanawha Valley, and many of those in right before that merger, they pulled out of that organization and began other organizations because they did not want to go with the merger. So all the churches basically we have in West Virginia today come out of the movement from Kanawha County and spread out across the state.
So they were really growing, or really grew all the way up into 1911. And then with the merger with the Northern Baptist, most of it was lost, except
Yes.
really in the territory where you're at
Yes.
today. Let's talk just a little bit more before we move on to kind of what happened after the merger. But we do have a church that's on the U.S. Historical Registry, don't we?
Yes. Up in we're the only church or only state that I know of that we have a actual Free Baptist church in a national historical park, which is Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. They recently made that a historical park just a few years ago. People are flocking in there to that area. But if you have a chance to go to Harpers Ferry, I'd encourage you to go. Free Will Baptist is mentioned throughout. There's actually plaques that will say this was Free Will Baptist. Stower College is there, which was for those slaves and freed slaves established there. And again, we lost all that during the merger. But since the Park Service has taken over that area, they've rebuilt all those old buildings, and all of that's there. All the history's there. There's a cemetery there where some of these great men are buried in that cemetery that worked with those slaves and helped establish that in the Harpers Ferry area. So I'd invite everybody to go that can to visit that area.
So it's a wonderful place. It's wonderful in U.S. history. It's wonderful for
Yes.
Free Baptist history, and also helps people see how Free Baptist had quite an impact in helping people that were oppressed. We think about
Right.
freedmen. We think about slaves, and how they were the ones that stepped up and helped folks in this time of
Yes.
crisis.
Yes. And let me just say this too. There was several unlikely people that helped, which you mentioned one, Abraham Lincoln, but also John Brown, the raid that he did there in the Harpers Ferry area. He was an abolitionist trying to keep slaves free. Because of his actions and what that brought attention to the nation, and then because of Abraham Lincoln and Emancipation Proclamation within a couple of years of each other, both of those very unlikely influences helped to bring about the West Virginia Free Will Baptist movement. And then later on, trying to think of his name off the top of President
Well, was it Garfield?
Garfield, I believe was.
Yeah.
He had a heritage of West Virginia Free Will Baptist. He
Yeah.
was trained in a school in Ohio, a college there in Ohio, Free Will Baptist College. So he did have, but he was instrumental in setting aside that property up there to become the historical site that it is today.
That is wonderful. Let's give a shout out to the clerks too. Like
Yes.
you alluded to that earlier, you
Yes.
need even present day clerks to get information to you.
Yes.
And one of the things we know is Harriet Beecher Stowe, writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin. She's given a lot of credit to Free Will Baptist clerks.
Yes.
She had written that people said what she wrote was sensational, and actually
Yes.
used the work of Free Will Baptist clerks to show, nope, this
Right.
is what really happened.
And that's where I got the vast part of my information. I got it from the national website, and people will go there. If you type in West Virginia Free Baptist history and you go on the site, there's tons of information there. I made some notes here. Let me just look real quickly, just a second. But if you go on the Free Baptist site, the digital archives, you pull up Baptist history, you can pull up the Randall history. There's tons of that. You all have done a great job in getting those minutes of the General Conference, the Cooperative General Conference. I could go on. There's about 10 different national organizational conferences that y'all have minutes of. I drew from that. I went through and pulled out those years of Free Will Baptist, anything pertaining to Free Will Baptist. Also in our state records, we went back through all of our state minute books, pulled out that information. Our state clerks, even the clerks of the churches, which we called, all of those helped me to gather this information that we got in the book. And also one thing that people don't know about very much, but it's called the Free Baptist Cyclopedia. You may have heard of it, but if you type in Free Will Baptist Cyclopedia, it'll still come up. It was written in the late 1800s, 600 plus pages. It has information on all the churches, the conferences, pastors, tons of information. So those are the vast area where I drew a lot of my information for the book.
That's great. So if you're a listener and you're into history, or let's say you're a teacher and you want to make sure the kids that you work with and you're dealing with, that they know more about U.S. history, more about Free Will Baptist history, really what Brother Rickie's mentioning is some good resources. And we need to give a shout out to the Historical Commission.
Yes.
Brother Eric Thompson has done such a good job maintaining that site. There's so much information there. Dr. Piccarilli has worked for many years trying to get the information you're talking about, Pastor Rickie. So they've got good pictures at the site, the Free Will Baptist History site. It's just a lot of great information. Got a lot of information about James Garfield, that you mentioned earlier too. So that's great. And then let's talk a little bit about after the merger, after 1911, which is kind of like West Virginia Free Will Baptist history to date, if you will.
Right.
Share with us a bit about that.
Okay, after the merger, and like I said, most of it developed from the Kanawha Valley after that. But we had a lot of great men. I've got a lot of men that I've researched and found out a lot of information about. Several men in particular, E.M. McVee, he helped establish a lot of the first churches in the Kanawha Valley. Another man by the name of Cox was one of the first to help in that area, first ones to preach in this area. But from those men, and also a man that come along a little bit later that helped establish the church where I'm at now, and he also traveled our state, as did others. Jeff Thomas, got a picture of him, got a beard way down to here, an old time fellow, if you will, but he traveled our state. These men were faithful back in the 1800s and early 1900s to get out in our state, go across our state, preach and establish churches. And from that, the growth just seemed to take off and to grow and grow and grow. And at one point, we had over probably 225 churches in West Virginia associated with the state association. Today, that number is down to about 140. A lot of them have pulled out because of things over the years. But we have tons of churches, Free Baptists in West Virginia, that are not associated with the state association. But presently, we have 140. But after that, all of that pushed forward. And then those different factions within our state came together to form a yearly meeting. And then it went to the state meeting. And then, of course, joining with the National Association when it was formed in 1935. So all of that grew together, and our state has been very supportive. And it was also, when it first organized, we were one of those states that organized with the National, one of the first states.
That's great.
Again, a lot of information there.
A lot of information. So we do encourage folks to check out the book, the DNA Timeline of West Virginia Free Will Baptist History. And we've got to also mention, Brother Rickie, when people think about West Virginia, they may think about the Hatfields and the McCoys. Yep. Yes. Tell us a bit about how they play in Free Will Baptist history.
Well, I don't know a lot of how they played in Free Will Baptist history, but I know they are well known throughout the country for the few they had. But if you really do a lot of study in that, it's been hyped up a whole lot more than what it really was.
Yes.
And they may have played part in that. I do not know. I have not researched that part out.
But really they ended up coming together, and
yes.
It's kind of an example of yes. what you're saying with West Virginia Free Will Baptist yes. history, where after the merger, yes. the churches took off and grew, and now they've come together in the 1935 merger. It's kind of an exciting thing.
Right. And one thing me and you I talked about before, both from the Randall movement and the Palmer movement in West Virginia. We had people from Maine come in, the Kanawha Valley area, they come in from Ohio. At one time, we had our state represented in as many as 3 or 4 national different groups at the same time. But all of that came together and established, as we said, the yearly, the state, and then the national, joined with the national.
It's quite a remarkable story, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And so if you want to learn more about this story, get a bit more about Free Will Baptist history, I want to encourage you to get Brother Rickie's book, A DNA Timeline of West Virginia Free Will Baptist History. And you're like, well, how can I get that? Well, I'm going to encourage you to send him an email at Rickie, Rickie, Holstein, Holstein, @yahoo.com. I suspect if you send him an email there, hey, tell me about this, Brother Rickie, or what about such and such? He would probably try to help you as well. And so really, you're an encyclopedia of information, Pastor Rickie, and could really be helpful to our listeners.
Yes, and if any of them, and I'd also like to challenge the other states to do what we've done here. And if they would contact me, I can help them. There's a lot of work. Eric wrote a good book about how to gather those records. And also I can share with them how we did that in the state of West Virginia to get that information and put it together.
That sounds like a great idea. And so we encourage folks, we encourage them to get Eric's book too, and think about our history, think about recording it. It's going to be so important for those that follow us to understand where they came from. So you've given us some good information. So thank you for writing the book, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
And we want to thank you, our listeners. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. And maybe you know someone that would benefit from this information. We encourage you to share this podcast with them. Remember, every little thing we do, it really does matter. It really does make a difference. We truly are better when we work together. We're better together. Thank you.